From the book by Warren L. May, Soldiers of Uncommon Valor, The History of Salvationists of African Descent in the United States, he writes, "In the midst of the most racially turbulent period in United States history, Black commissioned officers of the Salvation Army's Eastern Territory convened a special meeting to discuss race relations within the organization. Some Salvationists voiced opposition to such a meeting. The Black officers who wanted to bring down the walls of separation between themselves and the larger Salvation Army community persuaded Army leadership that their intention was not to become separatists or isolationists. Eventually, visionary leaders granted the Black officers permission to convene for the purpose of assessing their future in the Salvation Army. The long-range effects of this meeting was to force Salvation Army leadership to recognize the dual ministry both to Black officers and to the broader Black community served by the Army. The first African American Ministries Committee was a byproduct of the decades-long civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. This tumultuous period awakened our nation to the discrimination, racial segregation, social and political injustices, as well as the barriers to education, employment, and voting rights being experienced by the African American community.
That civil rights movement was for that time and that space. The Salvation Army served in these various communities, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York. We were serving both those who were first responders as well as families who were afflicted and affected.
I remember the late 50s, early 60s, the tumultuous times, the dogs, the fire hoses, the beatings, all of that. And as a young child, you're looking at that, and that's just something that just never leaves your mind.
I grew up in Hartford, so being in a city, you saw a lot of what was going on in the country being played out on a small scale within the city of Hartford. And I remember there was one point when the riots in Los Angeles were played out in the city of Hartford. And I remember being very concerned for my safety, not really understanding a whole lot about why things were happening. There was tear gas, there was police everywhere, and we felt a little bit uncomfortable.
So we came into this 69 meeting just out of that period of rife and so much intolerance, a sense of disconnection in our society. So we, the African American officers of African descent, were drawn together to say, look, we need to talk about this, and what does it mean for the ministry of the Salvation Army? What does it mean for we who are African descent as individuals serving in the Salvation Army, and I might add, called and consecrated to this precious ministry? What does that mean? What was going on outside the Salvation Army was having a definite impact within the Salvation Army. There were a group of us who got together, and our leader was Brigadier B. Barton McIntyre, a wonderful, saintly, godly, strong man. He was the senior-most Black officer at that time. Now remember, the framework is what's happening in civil society. And there were those who were reluctant. As a matter of fact, when we first broached the subject to territorial administration, we were frankly and candidly told, you can meet, but you get no endorsement, no support in any way. It's up to you. And you know why? Structures in America were under threat. Countries in upheaval. And there were those, and I understand this, who were very much afraid that we wanted to come together as officers of African descent to talk about the Salvation Army. Some even felt that we were, entertaining the notion of separatism, as if that could ever be. But there was this legitimate concern that what we would be talking about would be somehow affecting negatively the Salvation Army's mission. But we came together as men and women of African descent who genuinely loved the Salvation Army, who were strongly committed to Christ. But we felt that there needed to be some things addressed. So the early portion of the meetings, it was therapeutic. You had to talk about how you were feeling. When we stepped into our appointments on official duty, we didn't leave who we were and what was going on in general society. We brought that with us. So there was that need to talk about it, to flesh it out, and work our way through to then talking about what are some substantial things that really ought to happen. What should be an outcome of this? There are essentially two entities that helped us to arrive where we are in the very beginning. And the first entity was, of course, officers of African descent. But the second entity were those leaders of the day in the Salvation Army who were not afraid, who were courageous and said, no, there's something here that's good, and we have to dig it out and allow it to emerge. And I thank God for them.
They knew that there was another committee that had met just one time in 1969 of black officers, and out of that came some recommendations that really weren't followed.
I think the establishment of the committee in itself was an accomplishment. Considering the time period in which it was developed, it was a great step forward on behalf of the Salvation Army and those who really pushed forward to say that this is something we can't ignore. Not as an organization, not as a church, not as people of God, but this is something that's plaguing people who make up a large portion of our congregations, and we need to address them as we would any other issue that comes up in society and take a stand on it and make some meaningful actions toward resolving issues, bringing issues to light, and really just not sweeping them under the carpet.
There were expectations. I mean, if the Salvation Army leadership was going to, in fact, allow this to happen, they would expect a result. So there was that feeling of expectation. We honestly had expectations of ourselves at this point in that, I believe it was 1977 meeting. So we had expectations of ourselves. We wanted to make certain that the agenda was valid and that the outcomes could be things practically dealt with within the Salvation Army. And we recognize, too, that, again, there were some risks associated with it. And we would never have dreamed, no one really would have thought in 69 or 77 that, boy, we have this kind of opportunity and what it has meant to the Salvation Army as a whole. We also didn't go in to that meeting as separatists. We weren't separatist-minded. We understood that this was a magnificent Salvation Army mission, and there were other cultures that were beginning to arise within the ministry of the Salvation Army. We were getting smart as we looked at demographics and how people were moving, and certain predictions of what this sector of the country was going to look like. So we had to get ready for that. And so recognizing that we were a part of a larger body, and yet focus was on this population, the African descent folks.
My mother was one of the members, and I remember her being very excited about being a part of that ministry. And she would talk to us about what was going on. But at that time, I was older, and I was able to understand a lot more. And she shared with us a lot of what the committee was trying to accomplish within the Salvation Army, and just the difficulties and the challenges that they faced in those early years to really find legitimacy in what they were doing. I think that she felt that the committee was just formed to just kind of placate the black community within the Salvation Army and to sort of give us a kind of a voice, but not really. And that was very frustrating for her, and it was very eye-opening for me.
And the challenges in getting started in that committee was just, what were we to do? What did you want us to do, and how were we to reach out? And so in that first committee, there was a lot of meeting. There was a lot of brainstorming as to what to do.
You had many communities where there were young black men and women who were very capable of going into the training school, but for some reason there were challenges, and why aren't we doing a better job at recruiting young men and women of color into the training school? And when they became officers, those that went into the training school, then they were pretty much pigeonholed into appointments. There were certain appointments that they would have, and they would not have opportunities to really grow and develop in their ministries, so they would leave.
We said, hey, we need proper training of all officers. So we said we need to have some influence upon the curriculum at the school. That happened. We need officers to actually live and breathe in the inner city. At the time, a lot of them were just outside in the suburbs, and if you don't have anybody that's in the inner city, living and breathing and knowing what's going on,
I think just an overall sense of acceptance in the way that that we worship, which was a lot different in a lot of core and a lot of the black core. The gospel influence, that's part of our heritage. And I think that she felt that, and I think the committee felt as well, that was something that was shunned and that was taken as, well, that's how you guys do it, but in the Army we do it this way. And sort of trying to figure out how to merge the two, that they didn't need to be mutually exclusive, that they could be united and celebrated by everybody.
I would say the first committee at the time, we looked at that really hard, and we thought, like, hey, let's get together and let's have this Black Heritage Night and let the Army see that we're there, okay? And that night at the temple, I think we probably went over a whole lot more at the time than we even thought we would, in terms of young blacks at the time being able to see a full African descent band on the platform, a full chorus or songsters on the platform at the time at the temple. And I've never seen, to this day, the Centennial Memorial Temple that full than that first night. Of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. had a lot to do with it. That night, there was a specific excitement that ignited, I would think, the African descent community in the Salvation Army.
Began to see some change. One of the most significant was we began to sense a more openness in leadership in the Salvation Army. Now, not everybody in leadership was there. My wife and I experienced that ourselves, the bias. So we've come a long way from that. And how do we know we have? Well, just look at the population itself. Look at the strength of core and of ministry. Look at where Salvation Army officers of color have been deployed to serve in. Literally every strata, every area, every arena has been touched by a minority, a non-white. And that's just a beautiful thing. Now, I think the Eastern Territory during that time, those earlier days, had a bit of an advantage coming out of the civil disorder because we were ministering strongly already in certain communities, African American communities. So there was a head start there. We probably had more black officers at that time, officers of African descent, in the Eastern Territory than perhaps in others. So we had to take advantage of that. We had to capture, that moment. It was very, very important to recognize that. So that kind of gave us, I think, in the territory, a step ahead in terms of being able to deal with this. So we could have those conversations in the Eastern Territory, and I believe we were having them in advance of some other places in the country, some other territories. We could have those because we were ready. But as also referenced, we had individuals in leadership who were ready to take that challenge.
And years later, down in the early 2000s, we started the Empowerment Seminar. And I know specifically of officers that are now young lieutenants that are now officers because they went to the Empowerment Seminar.
Well, some of the empowerment workshops, one that was very well received was a workshop on worship and what worship is all about and how we worship and what true worship looks like. There was a workshop for young people and the challenges that they face in their lives to be Christian and believers in a world that drags them in a completely different direction.
I always like to encourage people to attend the Empowerment Conference because it's so valuable, particularly to soldiers. We can gain some of the tools that they need to take back to their communities and modify to be able to impact their local community. Their lessons, their breakout sessions, there's encouragement, there's sharing, there's fellowship. And all these things go into building that community that is a support network, really, to be able to give each other the tools and resources and connections to be able to be as effective as possible.
People's eyes were opened to their own prejudices, not just white on black or minority to minority or whatever. It was looking at your own prejudices as well. And I think that had a great impact among those who attended the seminars.
You can see some of the results of the committee's existence in the most recent cadet sessions. I think of the Joyful Intercessors in particular, which was such a diverse group of young, vibrant souls who want to go and do the work of God. And you look at the faces who make up that session. Many of them are people of color. I mean, they come from diverse ages, diverse experiences within the Army. And I think that's a testament to the committee's work in this territory, that there are officers who are working in their communities and building up leaders for the Salvation Army.
The work of this cultural committee, as well as the others, I believe they can help us dynamically ensure that we have a nimble, multi-peopled movement in this territory that will move the kingdom of our Lord forward, that will help us to see how we can be the best Salvation Army. Unified together, one heart. Doesn't matter the language or the culture, the color of the skin, that we are in this together and informing and sensitizing, that we become the Salvation Army, that when Jesus returns, can collectively say to all of us, well done, well done. And I think that the committee can keep that in mind, what they do, so that everything they do points to building a stronger, deeper, unified Salvation Army.
We are really excited about the opportunity that we have had to meet together with the other cultural committees. That's been one of our goals for a while, to just come together with the other committees and listen to their stories. And what was born out of the multicultural awareness training was dialogue. We need to talk. We need to hear and share more. We need to know each other's stories. We need to understand where it is that we have challenges that are similar, where we're similar and where we're different, and celebrate both and work with both. And I think that's where our next steps are. Now that we've really brought up and uncovered the challenges that we face, what do we do about them now? And one of the most poignant things for me was to be in that first combined committee meeting where all three of the committees came together and shared their stories. And we all found out we all have the same challenges, we all have the same goals. And so what a beautiful thing it was to recognize that in the Salvation Army, we have an opportunity to come together and unite just by sharing our stories and getting to understand each other's backgrounds, each other's challenges. And I've noticed, especially recently, how some of the territorial events are incorporating some of the cultural forms of worship.
The mission of the committee today is to continue to encourage, empower, and educate people on their potential, to remind people of color, to remind people in minority groups that you are the leaders we are looking for. You are more than capable of taking on the task and roles that your core and community needs you to take up, and that the change you want to see in your communities will start with you, and it can start with you, and you are effective. The challenges today, as much progress has been made, are very similar to the challenges of yesterday. They may look different. They may be to a lesser degree, but the root illness is still there. In our societies, we recognize that change is uncomfortable for a lot of people. Different makes us weary. It makes us concerned about the direction in which we're going. And history is a double-edged sword because we like the way it used to be. But the history of the Salvation Army is change. The tradition of the Salvation Army is progress. And to honor that history and to the people who've gone before us is to recognize that our challenges have changed the way they look, but still need to be addressed with the same vigor. The challenges of today, and particularly in minority communities, is a lack of authentic experience. The fire of the Salvation Army still burning in many communities, but the light isn't reaching everyone.
We need to make certain that we are informing our contingency, our people, that they know what's happening. This is a marvelous age in which we live with all the social media. Get that message out there. What are we doing? Get it out there. We got social media. Use it. Get it out there. Now, you can't tell everything, but that there's activities, movement here, and speak it, share it in the right way, in the right manner, so there's no distortion. We're in an age where the body of Christ has to go to where the sinners are, where there's depravity, where there's ugliness, where there's racism, where there's injustice. It's not going to come to us. We've got to take the gospel, the transforming power of the gospel, to those sectors in our society, and we can't do that by sitting behind our desk and protected in our four walls. Get out there in the thick of it. The front line of the mission is the field, see, and that's where it happens.